Thanks so much for the introduction. My name is Beatrice Povolo. I'm the Director of Food Safety and Regulatory Affairs with Food Allergy Canada. For those of you who may not be familiar with our organization, we are the national patient organization helping individuals and families live well with food allergy. Our mandate is really to help raise awareness, advocate, and educate the community on all things food allergy. Today, specifically, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what food allergy looks like in Canada, the Canadian landscape, and then give an update on some of the international guidance that recently came out of the Codex Committee on Food Labeling in May of 2026, which is quite exciting, I would say. I've spoken here before where I talk about this is such an exciting time for food allergy in Canada, and this last month or so has really proven that. So we're really excited to give some updates and happy to take questions as we go through. So as I mentioned, just from an agenda perspective, we'll talk a little bit about what's happening in Canada. We'll talk about some of the challenges that consumers and manufacturers have when it comes to labeling of food allergens, specifically precautionary allergen labeling, and then look at the updates that we're seeing globally and then how that will impact Canadians. So when we talk about the current reality in terms of how food allergy is managed in Canada, how many people are impacted, we currently have just over 3 million Canadians that are affected by food allergy, and that includes over 600,000 children. Many of you probably know someone with a food allergy or have a food allergy yourself. Just a show of hands, anyone have a food allergy or know of someone, family, friends, others that have food allergy? Right, so this is a condition that not only impacts the individual and the family, but it's also something that impacts others within the community. So if you have children in school, for example, or organized sports, camps, etc., there is always someone kind of in the group that has a food allergy and always looking to ensure that they continue to be included. We also know that 50% of families or households are indirectly impacted in that they know someone in their family and friends or in their community with food allergy, and everyone's trying to make informed decisions, have clear, accurate labeling so they can make decisions that can be accommodating as well. When we talk about food allergy, it's not something that just goes away, unfortunately. Many do have it lifelong. The primary way in order to avoid what you're allergic to is avoidance, of course, knowing what's in your food, regardless of how it's prepared, where it's prepared, how it's packaged. So whether it's food service or prepackaged food, everyone needs to know what's in their food in order to stay safe. Unfortunately, we still do have labeling gaps that makes that day-to-day management a bit tougher for people. So one of the gaps specifically that we're going to talk about today is precautionary allergen labeling, or may contain statements. And I'm sure everyone in this room is very familiar with what that means. There's very clear guidance from Health Canada when it comes to products that intentionally have an ingredient, especially an allergen, that is part of the recipe, part of the product. It's very straightforward. The labeling laws are very clear that it must appear in the ingredient information in plain, simple language. It can be done in the ingredient list itself. In this case, for example, showing that this particular product contains egg, wheat, and milk, and then there's a may contain for pecans, but when it's intentionally added, it has to be there in plain, simple English. However, when it comes to precautionary allergen labeling, where there is an inadvertent presence of or potentially inadvertent presence of an allergen that is not intended to be there, and it can it can happen as a result of cross-contamination, it gets a little bit trickier. There's no specific Health Canada or CFIA guidance or regulation when it comes to precautionary labeling, other than the general 5.1 in the Food and Drug Act that says you must be truthful and not misleading when it comes to labeling or marketing of a product. But to say that there is specific checklists, for example, for manufacturers to use when they're using a precautionary label or may contain, that currently is not there. However, that's something that we would like to see happen to create greater consistency in labeling and ensuring that consumers have the information they need to make a safe choice. Currently, consumers do find the may contain statements a bit confusing. They see it on some products and not on others. They run across what we call blanket may contain statements. So as an example here, this is an apple crumble from a manufacturer that basically has an ingredient list. And in the may contain, as you'll see almost every single allergen listed. And what's not listed in the may contain was in the contain statement. So basically this pie contains or may contain all top priority allergens in Canada. So when consumers see that, and we're running across that more and more, especially in some prepackaged products, the first thing that comes to their mind is not necessarily even allergens. Does this company have any good manufacturing practices? Do they have any food safety protocols? Because to say that a product may contain every single allergen really indicates kind of a lack of control, and that's not something that builds consumer confidence. We're also seeing these precautionary statements be extended in areas that they were never meant to be. So when Health Canada initiated their guidance in 2012, that's how far back it goes, on when to use precautionary labeling, it was only indicated for prepackaged products. However, now, as you can see in this example, we are seeing this blanket may contain in restaurants, food service. This is a retail, meat counter at a local grocery store. So the more and more it's being used and misused, the less confidence consumers have to look at it as a risk communication tool. And basically what that means is that consumers then tend to not necessarily avoid those products. They may take a risk on it, and they may make their own risk assessment in terms of that product as to whether they've had it before, what the actual likelihood is that all of those allergens might be cross-contaminating a product. So what we're starting to see is that individual consumers are not necessarily heeding those warnings. They are seeing the overuse and misuse, and as a result, they may be taking unnecessary risks, and we don't want that to happen. In addition to that, along with the consumer concerns, we also have manufacturers in the food industry that also continue to encounter various challenges that must be considered as they try to manage their own risks within their facilities. So for manufacturers, allergen management is considered a food safety issue. However, practices do vary, and not having specific standards in place can pose additional risks and liabilities. As we also know, food recalls are a major concern, and they're quite costly. In Canada, allergens continues to be one of the top reasons for recalls. Anywhere from 30–40% of recalls are allergen related, and that's just over the past decade, and it probably goes even further back than that. In addition, manufacturers are also looking for greater confidence and certainty when they're dealing with other third parties, insurance, and other claims or audit, and are trying to ensure that they've got the best protocols in place to ensure that they meet industry standards. And finally, the issue of PAL is a cause for concern as there's a proliferation of PAL, which is not necessarily based on a risk assessment in the current environment, and that continues to impact both consumer choice as well as various manufacturing practices. So all that said, that kind of some of the issues that we see in Canada today, and they're not unique to the Canadian market. I think when we talk to our counterparts in Europe, in Australia, and the US, we're all kind of in the same boat. So that's kind of the existing where we're at today. The exciting news is coming that there's some international guidelines that have been supported through the Codex Committee on Food Labeling, which I'd like to walk everybody through today. So the positive thing is that we're definitely seeing some standards that are being set, and that includes Canada as well. So for those that may not be familiar, the Codex Committee, the Codex Alimentarius Commission, it was established in 1963 by the World Health Organization and the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Their main purpose is to develop international food standards to protect consumers, protect consumer health and facilitate fair trading practices, specifically focused on food production, food labeling, and food safety. So at the 45th session in May of 2019, the two particular groups that are most interest, I think, to the food industry are the Codex Committee on Food Labeling and the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene. So in 2019, at the CCFL meeting, the FAO and WHO were asked to provide scientific advice to address the issue of precautionary labeling. They were asked to first look at the current global list of priority allergens to ensure that that was as up to date and that had the proper criteria around it to consider it to be a global allergen. They were asked to look at various allergen threshold levels, which we'll talk about in a minute, but basically at a level at which the majority of people with an allergy would not react to it, and then to provide some evidence and support on the use of precautionary labeling. So this all started in 2019. Whoops. Sorry. So to address the first question, a priority global allergen list was created. As you'll see here, the top priority allergens on a global basis are considered cereals containing gluten, crustacea, egg, fish, milk, peanut, sesame, specific tree nuts. Originally, soy was on the list, but because of the scientific advice that was provided, the global recommendations actually removed soy. Now, that's not to say that all jurisdictions, including Canada, would make any changes to their priority allergen list. In fact, that's probably not the case. But globally, based on the scientific evidence that looked at prevalence, severity, and potency, and reactions from individuals, this was the list that was decided. This has now been incorporated into the general standards of Codex and now makes up the new global list. In addition to that, the FAO/WHO came back and said that there's other allergens of concern, or ones that we've seen that can definitely cause severe allergic reactions, but aren't necessarily considered the priority list. So the other things like celery, lupin, and mustard, which are on the global list in the EU, for example, not necessarily here in Canada, other than mustard, were also being looked at. And then they also created what they call a watch list. And the watch list is other things that they're hearing about, that are up and coming, which includes certain pulses, insects, and other foods like kiwi, strawberry, etc. So just kind of giving a sense of where the scientific evidence was pointing at, but the big takeaway here is the global allergen list. The second piece has to do with allergen thresholds. So the expert committee drafted recommendations for allergen thresholds, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, refers to the amount of an allergen below which most allergic consumers would not react. The recommended level that they came up with was eliciting dose, or EDO5, which is protective of 95% of individuals with that particular allergen. Now, there's a number of considerations that came into this, and there's a number of reports, 100, 120 pages. If you want some easy reading, we're happy to share that with you. But the big takeaway here is that they were confident that this level would help to kind of provide guidance on PAL, be protective of the majority of individuals with food allergy, and help to kind of set, kind of a stake in the sand, so to speak, so that everyone had a particular level that they could be working towards. The actual threshold levels themselves, so in these charts, we see what the actual levels are. Hopefully it's big enough for everyone to see, and I'm happy to share the links to the reports as well. But the accepted evidence and the advice, CCFL accepted the evidence and advice from the FAO with the objective to establish scientifically derived population protective thresholds that allow risk-based allergen labeling, reduce unnecessary precautionary statements, and reflect realistic contamination levels in food manufacturing while maintaining a high degree of protection for allergic consumers. The reference doses are derived from clinical food challenge data in the allergic populations, and the researchers looked at estimate dose response curves for each allergen. From these curves, they identified the EDO5 levels, which, as I said, are protective of 95% of the allergic population. And they have made these recommendations, again, based on the scientific evidence, input from industry, governments, and other stakeholders within the CCFL consultation process. Okay. And then finally, the recommendation on precautionary allergen labeling. So this, again, took obviously quite a bit of time. So we started in 2019, and this was just passed in 2026. So can do the math. Things never take as long as you think they will, but in this case, we were very happy with the outcome in terms of the recommendations. So the objective really here of 4.1 is to establish and ensure that food businesses do not rely on may contain statements instead of implementing effective controls. So this principle, for example, we look at ensuring that precautionary label does not take or attempt to replace good manufacturing practices. I think that's a common food safety element and framework that most people work on. But the underlying logic is really to help to prevent the hazards where possible, control the hazards where prevention is not possible, and only use PAL if residual risk that remains after all the controls have been applied is apparent there. This follows the general Codex food safety principles that risk management should focus first on controlling hazards rather than just warning consumers about them. So I think that principle is not really shocking or new. I think that's fairly straightforward, but it was reiterated as part of the guidance. The second piece under precautionary labeling 4.2 was very much more specific in terms of how precautionary labeling needs to be done. And this is really the biggest, in my opinion, kind of the biggest change in terms of a focus and a recommendation, because it is now saying that before precautionary label is applied, we want to make sure that there is an effective risk assessment that's been done and able to inform that. So the CCFL recommended that PAL decisions be based on risk assessment because precautionary labeling should reflect an evidence-based evaluation of actual allergen risk than just the mere possibility of cross-contact. Beginning with a qualitative risk assessment and supplementing with quantitative assessment where appropriate provides a practical, science-based framework for determining whether residual allergen exposure may exceed an established reference dose, thereby reducing, hopefully reducing unnecessary precautionary statement and improving the reliability of allergen warnings for consumers. And this, I would say, as I said, is the biggest shift, because currently some companies do use a risk assessment to inform PAL and some don't, and a little bit of everything in between. So this really does help set the standard and also build consumer confidence, because if they see a precautionary label that's based on a true risk assessment, then that makes them, basically have greater confidence in the label and will avoid that product just because they know that there is a true risk to them. The next principle is Principle 4.3, which is, again, the fundamental objective of the committee was to move away from a system where PAL is triggered merely by cross-contact. So they adopted the reference doses, specifically, as I said, as an ED05, that would help to provide some objective, science-based determinants when deciding when to use precautionary allergen labeling. So the principles are really based on the rationale that PAL should reflect the likelihood of clinical relevant allergic reactions, that decisions should be based on a measurable exposure value, and that manufacturers and regulators should use a common scientific framework. And what the action levels can provide is a decision point of whether PAL is needed or not. In addition, the underlying theme throughout the PAL work is to improve usefulness and credibility of precautionary labeling for consumers. If PAL is used only when exposure exceeds the action levels, then we assume again that consumer confidence is greater. There's unnecessary avoidance of foods that may not be warranted, and that becomes a more effective risk communication tool. And that was really one of the intended guidance elements of the guidance outcomes, is to ensure that this becomes an effective risk communication tool again. And then there are a couple of other elements of the recommendations that, again, I think are worth noting. There were additional recommendations as part of the Codex work. I'm just really trying to highlight the ones I think that are most important and relevant for this audience. So the risk assessment thresholds are definitely the key. And then moving into a little bit more practical elements of how it's presented and what wording is used, etc. So section 5.2 and 5.2.2 are specific, and again, I think represent some great learnings moving forward. So CCFL recommended that the PAL statement appear as a separate statement directly or in close proximity to the ingredient list, because that's where consumers are looking for their information. Now in Canada, the guidance we have under the Safe Food for Canadians Act is just that, where it has the ingredient information, a contain statement if it's used, and then a may contain, and all of that is supposed to be in the same visual field. So it's nice to see that the same recommendations that we're using, that the practices in Canada are being reflected in best practices through Codex. Being able to locate PAL adjacent to an ingredient information provides a greater visibility, promotes consistency across presentation, and as I said, gives consumers clear line of vision into all the ingredient information that they're looking for. The second piece of this is really more about some of the nomenclature. So as many of you have seen, in Canada, we're fairly consistent about using may contain whenever that's that specific wording. In other areas, in the UK, in Europe, in Australia, you might see may be present, made on a facility, made in the same facility as, made on the same line, etc. There's a number of statements, and they're all intended to do the same thing, is to communicate risk to consumers. However, with the variation of these statements, consumers read them in a bit of a different way. So if you say may contain, I think they understand, okay, there could be a risk because of cross-contamination. If you say, well, the allergen is present in the facility, so there's peanuts in the facility or there's milk in the facility, but you're not saying it's specifically cross-contaminated in that product, they could actually view that as a lower risk as opposed to a may contain, or made on the same line would be a higher risk than a facility statement. So as you can see, there's some determination and some interpretation, and we kind of want to squash a little bit of that and make it very, very clear and ensure that the consistent wording is there. So the recommended wording is may contain. They do have or equivalent expression, because in some cases when you translate may contain, or there's not similar language in other countries, so there's a little bit of flexibility, but the recommendation is really to kind of keep it to a single phrase so that it means the same thing regardless of where you pick up a product in Canada, overseas, or anywhere else. So really just trying to unify and harmonize the wording so that, again, consumers are used to that and they understand the risks that are associated with that product. So in terms of next steps, so all of these recommendations that I've just shown to you today have been approved at the last Congress of CCFL. The next step now is for it to be ratified by the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which is meeting in July of this year, so in the next couple of weeks. And basically, it's up to them to decide that they would take all the recommendations from that particular guidance and then make it part of the standard. So the guidance becomes official standard and guidelines once it's formally adopted by the Commission and incorporated into the framework, and incorporated kind of into the overall framework. From there, national governments or jurisdictions would then decide how to implement it. So in Canada, for example, Health Canada, CFIA will be looking at this to determine, will this become enhanced policy, guidance, regulation, etc. So kind of the next step is really understanding how that will apply here in Canada. Different countries will review and adopt the guidance in different ways. We're hoping that it does get incorporated from a patient or from a consumer perspective regulation. Obviously, we feel that would be most relevant in order to ensure adoption. However, again, it really is up to each jurisdiction to decide under what kind of framework they will be adopting this type of guidance. So in practical terms, the Commission will approve that. Once the Commission, the approval is at this point, when the PAL guidance becomes official international reference, then it's really up to the regulators in each country to decide what they're going to do with that. So more news to come, but it's really exciting to see this moving forward. And then I just wanted to share with everyone just kind of a real world situation. So the Netherlands actually proceeded, before Codex was done doing their work, back in 2024, they already moved forward with the recommendations that I've just gone through, that I've just outlined with you. So they now have that as regulation in the Netherlands. It was adopted in January of 2024, and I think they had about a year transition period. So they have taken on the concept of risk assessment for PAL. They have to have documentation as a manufacturer in that country to show why they use PAL and why they don't, and basically kind of looking at the proof of burden on either scenario. So this is kind of a real world, test case that's happening on our, in the global stage, and we're excited to see what kind of results we're going to see from that. But just as an FYI, if anyone's interested, the Netherlands is a great case study to take a look at. So the other piece of this that I wanted to really focus on as well is that now that we have this type of guidance, is there any recommendations, is there any framework here in Canada that can be looked at that has the same types of principles? So the good news is that, as we look at facilitating a risk-based approach and looking at the guidelines, there is some measures here in Canada that I can share with you, and some best practices that we feel would be appropriate within the Canadian context. And really, I think if I've spoken about our Canadian guidelines before, but I'm happy to just kind of give a quick shout out to them and also show you some of the benefits and how they align with the new recommendations that are coming out. So with that, I'm going to be cognizant of the time. So Food Allergy Canada back in 2019, at the same time that Codex was making decisions to move forward on PAL, brought together a team of food manufacturers, government, academia, allergists, and other stakeholders to really focus in on how can we help manufacturers now. Are we able to put together industry best practices that can be useful in PAL, given that they're not specifically regulated, and that we would keep the scope, again, with prepackaged food, as that's really the focus of the guidelines. So with that, just a quick shout out in terms of the stakeholder groups that we did bring together as part of a steering committee and overall review committee, 16 food manufacturers, 2 of our leading Canadian allergists, our partners at Maple Leaf Food and the University of Laval, Dr. Samuel Godefroy's team, working together to put together best practices for Canadian manufacturers. And basically what that approach looked like is looking at what is the current evidence that we have globally in terms of best practices for allergen management and specifically precautionary labeling, the consultation with industry and key stakeholders, and bringing together a small group of manufacturers to help actually write the guidelines, vet them, and share them within kind of the cohort, and then be able to publish them, which we did in November of 2022. So just as a very high-level overview of how the guidelines were structured, they provide a step-by-step guidance on how to develop an allergen control plan, which again, many of you are familiar with and is very common practice, but it does include on how to identify, control, and manage allergens, as well as dedicated sections on how to assess and communicate risk to consumers. And it's really this piece on risk assessment at the end that really focuses on PAL that I think gives it a bit of a differentiator. And as I said, really does align with what Codex is representing. So specifically, the guidelines provide recommendations on how to make informed decisions on PAL, taking a risk-based approach, beginning with the principles that PAL must only be used to communicate an unintentional, unavoidable presence of allergens at a level that poses a risk to most allergic consumers, as determined by a risk assessment. So as you recall, in the Codex text, it does say that a risk assessment, starting with a qualitative risk assessment and supplemented with a quantitative one, is the recommendations from the group. In our guidelines, we follow the identical type of approach and outline the specific process to follow for both qualitative and quantitative risk assessment to determine the need for PAL. So just quickly for those that might be interested in terms of the qualitative risk assessment, so it's really taking an objective evidence approach where control measures fail or pass and having a review process in the entirety from start to finish from the manufacturing side. This information could include the identification of where the process controls fail, if they do, combined with evidence of such of those challenges, some objective evidence for assessing the risk mitigation effect of control measures, for example, visual observation, analytical data, validation testing, etc. And in the qualitative assessment, it's recommended that food operators gather the evidence from the entire manufacturing process, including raw materials, receiving, storage, design of premises, etc., that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, to be able to come to a conclusion and take a weight of evidence approach. If that does not come to an effective conclusion, or it determines, yes, the risk is there, then a PAL statement can be used. If it's inconclusive or they're unsure, then moving to a quantitative risk assessment is the overall recommendation. So when a qualitative assessment doesn't provide conclusive information for PAL, then a quantitative assessment can be considered. The main difference, as many of you know, for qualitative and quantitative assessment is the nature of the input, non-numerical data versus numerical, for example. And as described earlier, qualified assessment considers where the allergen control measures fail or pass based on the objective evidence, such as visual observation. So in contrast with the quantitative assessment, an estimated allergen protein exposure intake dose from consumption of a specific food is compared to the allergen protein dose predicted not to elicit a reaction, so EDO5. So simply put, the risk may be estimated in this fashion. If the estimated exposure dose is higher than the eliciting dose, the food product may pose a risk to consumers and a PAL is warranted. But using either qualitative or quantitative risk assessment will provide greater certainty for manufacturer on the need for PAL and also make it more meaningful for consumers. So in terms of some of the key outcomes of this work and the benefits, I think, hopefully they're fairly clear. But the guidelines really aim to provide food manufacturers with a structured approach to allergen management based on best practices, specifically focused on using risk assessment to determine PAL, which is in accordance with the international guidance and the Codex work, as well as the recommendations from the FAO-WHO expert working group that was at the core of these recommendations. It will help to standardize that process as well to improve consumer confidence and trust and become, as I said, a more meaningful risk communication tool. For food manufacturers, this tool can help minimize the potential risks, support audits, requirements, insurance claims, etc. So I think overall it can give both confidence and comfort to both consumers as well as to the industry partners. So moving forward, we're hopeful that the guidance are something that industry can use and will use. We're very lucky that they are, as I said, aligned with the Codex recommendation. That was done by design, just given our work coincided with the recommendations from Codex that started in 2019. We've put kind of I hope everyone can see that, the link. They were partially funded from a grant from Agriculture Canada, known as AgriAssurance, and our manufacturers, so we were able to provide them for free, both in English and French, so please feel free to download them and to utilize them. There are also other types of tools with the guidelines, initial risk self-assessment tool. There's a 10-module training program that aligns with the recommendations as well, so again, feel free to download and use and share. And then just as we close off, just to kind of give everyone a bit of an update, because again, May was a very important month for Food Allergy Canada and the community. Not only was it Food Allergy Awareness Month, and Codex came up with these great recommendations, but we are seeing some movement on the development of a national framework for food allergy. We were fortunate enough to have support through a senator. Senator Andrew Cardozo put forth a bill in the Senate in May, the first of its kind, to establish a national framework for food allergy, and that would include a path forward to reduce the incidence or risk of food allergy, improve access to diagnosis and treatment, and also to help with ensuring that there's accurate ingredient information for all food that Canadians purchase or buy, whether it's food service or through manufacturing. So we're very excited to have this opportunity to work with federally to advance the issues on food allergy and food labeling. So more to come on that in the years to come, but wanted to share that. And we kind of talk about its bill number 247, which means, for us, managing food allergy is a 24/7 vigilant opportunity. So we were very fortunate to get a bill that would actually reflect that. So just wanted to share that with the group as well. And with that, I'm going to conclude my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you so much for your time. Nothing? Anybody? Danish? Oh. Hi, Danish. It's hot up here.
Great presentation and good information that came from the CCFL, and you're kind of distributing to the knowledge to the other people. My question is about the industry. How would the capacity or the capability of the industry to do those reference value measurements? Because on paper it looks great, but in theory, in practicality, when they have to do these risk assessments and have to refine the reference doses and then determine if that is below the reference doses, it's not an easy task for a small-scale company. So I wonder, from your perspective, where would that help come from, and how would the industry adopt that? I'm sure that Health Canada would come very soon with the guidelines or a regulation, whatever it is.
Right.
But then will there be time for industry to react and those kind of things? So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Danish. That's a great question. So I think your point at the end in terms of Health Canada coming back with some recommendations and, whether, again, this will be policy, regulation, guidance, et cetera, I think that is hopefully forthcoming sooner than later. But with that, there has to be an acknowledgement, as you said, that not all companies are necessarily geared up or have the knowledge, the wherewithal, the resource to perform risk assessment. And I think that's the key to all of this. Through CCFL, just to step back for a moment, they are looking at a mentorship type program for various countries and even looking at size of businesses, how they can help. But I think nationally or domestically, being able to look at whether it's resources like ours that kind of give a step-by-step process, working with government government officials and CFIA and Health Canada on, what can be enhanced in the guidance they do today, and is there risk assessment models that they can use as well. So I think all of that, I would again, I'm coming from the consumer perspective, the industry perspective is obviously in the room, but pushing for that type of guidance. And even from a mentorship perspective, we've got some great companies in Canada that do a great job with risk assessment. Again, they have the tools, the wherewithal to do that. Is there an opportunity for them to help mentor some of the small to medium companies where when they look at this, they might get overwhelmed and maybe not know where to start? We would like to kind of see that approach taken as well. But as a voice in the room, as people who do food safety assessments and protect our food supply, a lot of this will come from you guys as well. Like if there's best practices that you have that you're able to share, because at the end of the day, we see allergen management as kind of like it's a food safety issue. It should not be a competitive advantage issue. So, and when the industry thrives on risk assessment and ensuring safe food, I think everybody does. It just takes one recall for consumer confidence to go down when there's one recall with one company. So the more we can avoid all of that and ensure people are not reacting to our food, I think that's going to be beneficial. Thanks. Yeah, right here. There's a question. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Sorry, I think we're at time. Sorry about that. But yeah, no worries. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time today, and I hope you have a great rest of the session.